Some people are born into a world that has no place for them. Ayana was one of those people. When Callum first saw her crouched behind the general store, picking through discarded vegetable scraps like a starving animal, he noticed three things immediately. Her clothes were nothing more than torn rags held together with strips of leather. Her frame was massive, towering, and muscular in a way that made grown men step back instinctively. And her eyes carried the kind of shame that comes from being treated like a monster for so long. You start to believe it yourself. What Callum didn't know yet was that the woman eating scraps in the alley was royalty, and what he would do for her in the days that followed would trigger an ancient tradition that would bring 500 warriors to his doorstep and change both their lives forever. The late afternoon sun beat down on the dusty street as Callum Ashford locked the door to his tailor shop. 3 years of working alone had taught him to appreciate the silence. The loss of his wife still sat heavy in his chest, a weight that never quite lifted no matter how many hours he spent hunched over his Singer sewing machine. He'd built a life of routine and solitude in this small frontier settlement, favored, empowered even as the Arawan townspeople whispered about the strange man who lived above his shop and never remarried. He was carrying a basket of fabric scraps to the burn pile when he heard the sound, a low, desperate whimper coming from behind Horace's general store. Callum paused, his weathered hands tightening on the basket handle. The sound came again, and this time he recognized it for what it was. Hunger. The kind of hunger that gnaws at your insides until dignity becomes a luxury you can no longer afford. He set down the basket and walked slowly toward the narrow alley between the buildings. The smell hit him first. Unwashed skin, old sweat, and something else. Fear. When he rounded the corner, he saw her. She was massive, easily over 6 feet tall with shoulders broader than most men he knew. Her arms were thick with muscle, her hands scarred and calloused, but it was the rags that made his chest tighten. What she wore couldn't even be called clothing anymore. Torn pieces of canvas and leather barely held together. Exposing sun-darkened skin stretched over powerful muscle. Her long black hair hung in matted tangles around a face that might have been beautiful if it wasn't hollowed out by starvation and marked by bruises. She looked up at his approach and her eyes went wide with panic. She tried to stand to run, but her legs trembled and she stumbled against the wall. Her hands came up defensively, and Callum saw fresh cuts across her knuckles. Someone had hit her recently, or she'd hit them. He raised his hand slowly, palms out, no sudden movements. He'd learned that much from dealing with frightened animals on his small property outside town. People weren't so different when they'd been cornered too many times. Easy now. He said quietly, "I'm not here to cause trouble." Her eyes darted past him toward the street, calculating escape routes. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her gaze, the sharp awareness of someone who'd learned to read danger in every shadow. She didn't speak, but her breathing came fast and shallow. Callum noticed something else then, the way her massive frame seemed to fold in on itself, trying to become smaller, invisible. It was a heartbreaking sight. A woman built like a warrior trying to disappear. He slowly reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the dried meat and bread he'd wrapped for his evening meal. He set it on the ground between them and took 3 steps back. "You look like you could use this more than me." She stared at the food, then at him, suspicion written across every line of her face. He could practically hear her thoughts. What does he want? What's the price? Nothing came free. Not for someone like her. No strings, Callum said, reading her hesitation. Just food. That's all. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl that echoed in the narrow space. Her jaw clenched, and something that looked like shame flickered across her features, but hunger won out over pride. She lunged forward, snatched the food, and retreated to the far wall in one fluid motion. Her movements had a strange grace despite their desperation. She tore into the bread with strong white teeth, barely chewing, her eyes never leaving him. Callum watched her eat with the focused intensity of someone who didn't know where their next meal was coming from. He'd seen that look before in the early days after his wife's passing, when grief had stolen his appetite for weeks. But this was different. This was someone who'd been living on the edge of survival for far longer. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" he asked. She paused mid-bite, studying him with those dark, penetrating eyes. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she swallowed and spoke for the first time. Her voice was rough, unused, with an accent he couldn't quite place. 4 days, maybe 5. The simple honesty of it hit him harder than any soba story could have. No excuses, no begging, just the raw truth. "You have somewhere to stay tonight." Her laugh was bitter and short. "The woods. When the men from the saloon aren't trying to chase me out of those two." Callum felt something shift in his chest. A decision forming before he'd fully thought it through. He'd spent 3 years in careful isolation, protecting himself from further loss by refusing to let anyone close. But looking at this woman, who the world had decided wasn't worth basic human dignity, something his wife used to say came back to him. "We're only as good as how we treat those who can't do anything for us. I have a workshop," he heard himself saying, "attached to my shop. It's warm and dry. You could stay there tonight." The suspicion returned to her eyes, sharper now. Why? It was a fair question. In her experience, kindness probably came with teeth. "Because it's going to rain," Callum said, glancing at the darkening clouds gathering on the horizon. "And because I've got the space, what do you want in return?" The directness of it. No games, no pretense, just survival instinct honed by hard experience. "Nothing you're not willing to give," he said carefully. "A safe place to sleep. That's all I'm offering." She studied him for a long time, weighing his words against every betrayal she'd probably endured. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. As Callum turned to lead her back to his shop, he caught movement from the corner of his eye. 3 men stood at the mouth of the alley, their faces twisted with disgust. The one in front, Samuel Bridger, owned the land office and considered himself the settlement's moral authority. "Callum," Samuel called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "Step away from that creature. She's dangerous." The woman behind him tensed, and Callum felt her preparing to run, but something in him had already decided. Maybe it was 3 years of loneliness talking. Maybe it was grief finally pushing him towards something resembling purpose. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that he'd looked into her eyes and seen a person where everyone else saw a problem. "She's coming with me," Callum said quietly, "and anyone who has an issue with that can take it up with me directly." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken threat. But Callum held his ground, and after a moment, Samuel spat into the dirt and walked away, his companions following. They'd remember this, though. Small towns always did. When he turned back, the woman was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Somewhere between gratitude and disbelief, with a hint of something that might have been hope, trying to stay buried. "Come on," he said gently, before they changed their minds about making a scene. As they walked through the back streets toward his shop, Callum couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped onto a path with no clear destination. The woman moved beside him like a shadow, her massive frame somehow making no sound despite the loose gravel under their feet. Professional silence, the kind you learned when being seen meant being hurt. But what neither of them knew as the first drops of rain began to fall was that this moment, this simple act of unexpected mercy, had already set something in motion. Something that had been waiting in the wings of fate for exactly this unlikely pair to come together. And by tomorrow morning, the entire settlement would be surrounded by 500 mounted warriors, all of them there because of the woman walking silently beside him. All of them there because of what Callum was about to do with his needle and thread, and his refusal to see a monster where a person stood. The workshop smelled of leather, cotton, and machine oil. Ayanna stood in the doorway like she was waiting for permission to breathe. Her massive frame seemed too large for the space, though the room was actually generous. Callum realized she'd probably spent so long being told she took up too much room that she'd learned to make herself small, even when she didn't need to. He lit 2 oil lamps, casting warm light across his work where fabric samples lay in neat stacks. His Singer sewing machine sat in the corner, the foot pedal worn smooth from years of use. Shelves lined the walls, holding spools of thread in every color, buttons sorted by size, and measuring tapes coiled like sleeping snakes. "You can sit anywhere," Callum said, gesturing to a sturdy wooden bench near the stove. "I'll get the fire going." She moved with careful precision, each step calculated to avoid knocking anything over. When she finally sat, the bench creaked but held. She kept her eyes down, hands folded in her lap like a child, expecting punishment. Callum busied himself with kindling and wood, giving her time to adjust. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was loaded, full of questions neither knew how to ask. When the fire caught and warmth began spreading through the room, he filled a basin with water from the pump outside and set it on the bench beside her with a clean cloth and a bar of soap. Simple gestures, the kind that shouldn't feel revolutionary, but somehow did. "You can wash up if you want," he said. "I'll be at the work. I've got orders to finish." He turned his back deliberately, giving her privacy. Behind him, he heard the soft splash of water, then the careful movements of someone washing quickly, efficiently, like they might lose the opportunity at any moment. When the sound stopped, he waited another full minute before turning around. She'd cleaned her face and hands, revealing skin the color of warm bronze underneath the layers of dirt. The bruises stood out more clearly now, fresh ones on her jaw and cheekbone, older ones yellowing along her forearms. Her hair, still matted, but slightly cleaner, fell past her shoulders in thick waves, but it was her body that told the real story. Now that she was sitting in better light, Callum could see the full extent of her build, muscles that most men would envy, shoulders that could carry heavy loads without strain, arms that had clearly done hard physical labor for years. Yet the rags she wore were so inadequate, they barely covered her. Strips of canvas tied with leather cord, torn fabric that might have once been a skirt, nothing that remotely fit her frame. The question came before he could stop it. "Why don't you have proper clothes?" She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since they'd entered the workshop. "Because nothing fits, never has." The simple truth of it landed heavy. He thought about all the dresses in his shop, all the women he'd measured and fitted over the years, standard sizes that assumed certain proportions, bodies that fell within expected ranges. She existed outside those ranges, outside what people considered normal or acceptable. "My mother tried," Ayanna continued, her voice quiet but steady. "When I was young, she would stay up late cutting and sewing, but I kept growing. By the time I was 12, I was taller than my father. By 15, I looked like this." She gestured at her frame without self-pity, just stating facts. "The people in my village started calling me monster, cursed. My mother defended me until the day she passed. After that, there was no one left who saw me as human." Callum set down the shirt he'd been hemming. Your village, where was that? 3 days west in the high country. She paused, weighing how much to reveal. My people have lived there for more generations than anyone can count, but I haven't been welcome there for 2 years now. Because of how you look, because of who I refuse to become, the distinction mattered. He could hear it in her voice. This wasn't about her appearance alone. There was something deeper, something she wasn't ready to share yet. Before he could press further, footsteps sounded on the stairs outside. Heavy boots, multiple pairs, then 3 sharp knocks on the door. Not friendly knocks, demanding ones. Ayana was on her feet instantly, every muscle tensed for flight or fight. Callum recognized the look, prey animal about to bolt. He held up one hand in a calming gesture and walked to the door, opening it only wide enough to block the view inside. Samuel Bridger stood on the landing with 2 other men from the settlement. Their faces were set with righteous determination, the kind of expression that preceded violence dressed up as justice. Callum, Samuel said, not bothering with pleasantries, we need to talk about that thing you brought into town. Her name is Ayana, Callum replied evenly, and she's staying in my workshop on my property, which means this isn't your concern. It becomes our concern when you harbor dangerous elements. We have families here, children. That creature could hurt someone. Behind him, Callum heard Ayana's sharp intake of breath. He knew without looking that she'd heard every word, that each one had landed like a blow. She's a person, Callum said, his voice harder now, and unless you have actual evidence of a crime, you have no right to be here making accusations. Samuel's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. When something happens, it'll be on your head. Then it'll be on my head. Now get off my property. The 3 men stood there for a long moment, weighing their options. Callum kept his hand on the door, ready to slam it shut if they tried to push past. Finally, Samuel stepped back. Don't say we didn't warn you, he muttered, then turned and led his companions back down the stairs. Callum closed and locked the door. When he turned around, Ayana was standing with her back against the far wall, her whole body trembling, not with fear, he realized, with rage, pure, barely contained fury. This is why I live in the woods, she said, her voice shaking. This is why I eat scraps and sleep in the cold, because everywhere I go, people see a monster, a threat, something to be driven away. I don't see a monster, Callum said quietly. She laughed, bitter and broken. You will, they all do eventually. He walked to his fabric shelves and pulled down a roll of sturdy cotton, cream-colored, simple but quality material. Then another in pale blue. He laid them on the work, spreading them out. What are you doing? She asked. Taking your measurements. He replied, reaching for his measuring tape. If you'll let me. She stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Why? Because you deserve to wear something that fits. Something that makes you feel human instead of hidden. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, carefully, she stepped away from the wall and walked toward the work. Her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, but she blinked them back. What Callum didn't know was that this simple offer, this basic act of human dignity, was about to trigger a chain of events that would bring her entire world to his doorstep. And what she wasn't telling him was that in her people's tradition, the person who clothed you in honor becomes bound to you in ways that transcended simple kindness. Taking Ayana's measurements felt like diffusing a trap. Every time Callum's hands came near her, she flinched. Small, involuntary movements that spoke of too many hands that had grabbed instead of asked. He worked slowly, announcing each measurement before he took it. Keeping his touch professional and brief, her shoulders measured broader than any man he'd ever fitted. Her arms were thick with muscle, her waist surprisingly narrow despite her powerful frame. When he measured her height, the tape showed 6 FD and 3 in. She stood perfectly still through it all, eyes fixed on the far wall, breathing shallow. "You can relax," Callum said gently. "I'm almost done. I'm not good at relaxing." He could believe it. She carried tension in every line of her body, wound tight like a spring, ready to snap. When he finally stepped back and wrote down the last measurement, she visibly sagged with relief. "How long will it take?" she asked. Callum studied the numbers, doing calculations in his head. A dress this size would require more fabric than usual, more time, more precision. 2 days, maybe 3 if I work normal hours. She nodded, accepting this. "I'll be gone by then." "You don't need to finish it." "Gone where?" "Somewhere else." "Somewhere they haven't decided I'm a threat yet." She said it matter-of-factly, like she'd done this dance before. "Stay until the hostility builds, then move on before things turn violent. Survival through constant motion." Callum set down his measuring tape and looked at her directly. "What if you didn't have to keep running?" "That's not how the world works, not for people like me." "People like you," he repeated. "You mean people who are different." "I mean people who scare others just by existing." He thought about that, about how humans react to anything outside their understanding. About how fear gets dressed up as righteousness, as protection, as necessary cruelty. His wife used to say that small minds needed smaller targets. Looking at Ayanna, he understood what she'd meant. "I'm going to make you a white dress," Callum said suddenly. She blinked, confused by the specificity. "Why?" "Because white means something. It means clean, new, worthy." He pulled down a roll of fine white cotton from his highest shelf. Material he'd been saving for something special. "It means you're not what they say you are." Ayanna's expression shifted. Something vulnerable flickering across her features before she locked it away. "White gets dirty. White shows every stain. Then we'll make it sturdy enough to wash, strong enough to last." He spread the fabric on his work, the lamplight making it glow softly. "This is good material. It deserves to be worn by someone who will appreciate it." She stepped closer, reaching out to touch the fabric, then pulling her hand back like she might contaminate it. Her fingers were scarred and calloused, nails broken from hard work. Not the hands of someone who wore fine white dresses. "I can't pay you," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to, then why?" It was the same question she'd asked in the alley. Why would anyone show her basic human dignity without expecting something in return? Callum didn't have a simple answer. Maybe it was grief making him reckless. Maybe it was 3 years of isolation making him hungry for purpose. Or maybe it was just that he'd looked into her eyes and seen someone worth seeing. Because everyone deserves at least one thing that makes them feel like they matter, he said. The words hung in the air between them. Ayanna's jaw worked like she was chewing on something painful. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "In my people's tradition, there are rules about clothing, about what different colors mean, about who has the right to wear certain things." Callum listened, sensing this was important. White is sacred. It's worn for ceremonies, for important moments. She paused, struggling with whether to continue. When a woman is given white clothing by someone outside her family, it means something specific. It means that person sees her as worthy of honor, of respect. "Good," Callum said, "because that's exactly what I'm saying." She shook her head. "You don't understand. In my tribe, if a man clothes a woman in white, he's declaring his intention. He's saying she has value. And if she accepts it, if she wears what he made, she's accepting that declaration." The weight of this settled over the room. Callum could see she was trying to warn him, to give him a chance to back out before he stepped into something he didn't fully understand. But looking at her standing there in rags, shoulders hunched from a lifetime of being told she was too much, too big, too different, he couldn't imagine walking back his offer. "Then I guess I'm making a "Declaration," he said. "You don't even know me. I know enough." She studied him for a long moment, searching for the catch, for the ulterior motive, for the moment when his kindness would reveal its teeth. But Callum just stood there, patient and steady, waiting for her decision. Finally, she nodded. Just once, a small movement that carried enormous weight. "If I accept this," she said carefully, "if I wear what you make, there will be consequences. My people have long memories. They see everything, even when you think they're far away." What kind of consequences? But she just shook her head. "Finish the dress first, then we'll see if you still want me to have it." Outside, the rain had started in earnest, drumming on the roof in steady rhythm. Callum walked to the window and looked out at the dark street. No movement, no lanterns. Everyone had retreated indoors, safe in their homes with their families and their certainties about who deserved kindness and who didn't. He turned back to find Ayanna watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude mixed with dread, hope mixed with resignation, like she'd been waiting for something like this her whole life, but never believed it would actually come. "Get some rest," Callum said, gesturing to the bench near the stove where he'd laid out blankets. "I'll work through the night. By morning, you'll have something decent to wear." She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you." 2 words, simple and insufficient for everything they carried. As Ayanna settled onto the bench, and Callum took his seat at the Singer sewing machine. Neither of them could have known that 3 days west in the high country where her people lived, scouts had already brought news. News that the chief's daughter had been seen. News that someone in a frontier settlement was showing her the kind of respect that activated old traditions, old obligations, and by dawn, 500 warriors would begin their journey. Not to rescue her, not to punish her, but to witness what happened when someone finally treated their princess like she was worthy of honor. The rhythm of the Singer sewing machine became the only sound in the world. Callum's feet worked the pedal with practiced precision, his hands guiding white fabric under the needle in steady lines. He dismissed his usual careful pace. Tonight required speed without sacrificing quality. Tonight mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. Ayanna lay on the bench near the stove, but she wasn't sleeping. He could tell by the way she breathed, shallow and alert, watching him work through half-closed eyes. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she believed he'd actually finish, whether she'd worn anything made specifically for her in years, maybe ever. The dress took shape slowly. He cut the fabric generously, accounting for her shoulders, her height, her powerful build, simple lines, no frills or decorations that would make her feel like a costume. Just clean construction that would fit properly and move with her body instead of fighting it. Around midnight, she finally spoke. "You don't have to do this." Callum didn't look up from his work. "I know, then why are you?" He paused, considering the question. The real answer lies somewhere deeper than words. It had to do with his wife's final words before the fever took her. "Take care of someone. Don't let grief make you useless." It had to do with 3 years of watching himself become exactly what she'd warned against. A man so afraid of loss that he'd stopped living entirely. "Because I can," he finally said. "Because I have the skill and the materials and the time. And because you need it." She repeated, tasting the word. "I've gotten by without proper clothes for 2 years. Survival isn't the same as living." The truth of it settled between them. She sat up, blanket falling from her shoulders, firelight catching the angles of her face. Even exhausted and underfed, she was striking. Not beautiful in the way most people meant the word. Beautiful the way a mountain was beautiful, imposing, and undeniable, and absolutely itself. "In my village," she said quietly, "my father wanted me to marry. He had 3 men chosen, chiefs from allied tribes, men who could bring strength to our people." Callum kept working, sensing she needed to tell this story, that it was important to understanding why she'd been alone for 2 years. I refused all three, not because they were cruel or unworthy, but because they wanted me to be smaller, quieter. They wanted a woman who would stand behind them and bear children and never question. She laughed without humor, but I was already taller than all of them, stronger than most of their warriors. How could I make myself less than what I am? So they banished you. My father did. He said I brought shame to our people by refusing my duty, that a woman my size should be grateful anyone wanted her at all. Her voice hardened. He gave me 1 day to leave, told me if I returned I'd be treated as an enemy. Callum's hand stilled on the fabric. Your own father, he's chief first, father's second. That's how it works in my world. The bitterness in her voice was earned. Callum understood then why she'd been living like an animal. She'd been cast out from the only world that knew her language, understood her heritage, forced into settlements where she was too different to ever belong, too visible to hide, too strong to be ignored. What about your mother? She passed when I was 16. Fever took her, same as it takes so many. Ayana's expression softened slightly. She used to tell me I was exactly as I should be, that the Creator doesn't make mistakes, that someone would see me properly one day. Callum picked up the dress from his work, examining the seams in the lamplight, nearly finished. Just the hem left and some reinforcement at the shoulders. She was right. Ayana stood and walked closer, drawn by the sight of something made specifically for her body. She reached out, fingers hovering over the white fabric, not quite touching. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's practical, Callum corrected. Sturdy enough to last, simple enough to move in, white enough to make a statement. What statement? He met her eyes. That you're exactly as you should be, that anyone who can't see that is the one with the problem, not you. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the armor she'd built around herself for just a moment. He saw the girl she must have been before the world taught her to expect cruelty. Before rejection became so constant, she learned to reject herself first. When the sun rises, she said carefully, things will change. My people have ways of knowing things. They'll have heard by now that someone showed me honor, that someone made me white clothing. Let them know you don't understand what that means, then explain it to me. But she just shook her head. Finish the dress first. Put it on me. Then we'll see if you still feel the same when 500 warriors surround your home. The number hit him like cold water. 500, not a raiding party, not a small group, an entire tribe mobilized, coming here because of a dress, because of what that dress represented in their traditions. Callum looked down at the white fabric in his hands, at the hours of work it represented, at the simple act of human decency that had somehow become a declaration of war or alliance or something else entirely that he didn't fully grasp. He could stop now, could tell her to leave before dawn, could save himself from whatever was coming with the sunrise, but looking at Ayana standing there, still not quite believing someone had made something just for her, he knew he'd already made his choice. Then, I guess we'd better be ready, he said, and returned to his sewing machine. The needle punched through fabric and steady rhythm, each stitch binding him to consequences he couldn't yet see. Dawn came, pale and cold. Callum set down his scissors after trimming the final threads and held up the completed dress. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, his fingers etched from hours of precise work. But the garment was flawless, white cotton that would drape properly, seams reinforced to handle her movements, a neckline that was modest but not restrictive, sleeves that would accommodate her muscular arms without binding. He turned to find Ayana already awake, sitting upright on the bench, staring at the dress with an expression he couldn't quite read. Fear and longing mixed together, like she wanted desperately to put it on, but was terrified of what would happen when she did. It's finished, Callum said simply. She stood slowly, her full height emphasizing just how much fabric he needed, how much care. She approached the work like it held something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Once I put this on, she said quietly, there's no going back. Not for you, not for me. I understand. You really don't. But you will. She reached out and took the dress from his hands. Their fingers brushed, and he felt how badly she was trembling. Not from cold, from the weight of this moment, from years of being denied basic dignity, finally being offered something precious. Callum turned his back, giving her privacy. He heard the rustle of fabric, the soft sounds of her removing the rag she'd worn for so long, the whisper of white cotton sliding over skin, then silence, long and heavy. When he finally turned around, his breath caught. The transformation wasn't physical. Exactly. She was still the same woman, same height, same powerful build, same scarred hands. But the dress changed everything about how she carried herself. Her shoulders, usually hunched in, defensive posture straightened, her chin lifted. She stood at her full height without apology, and the white fabric moved with her like it belonged there. She was magnificent. How do I look? She asked, her voice smaller than he'd ever heard it. Callum crossed the room and stood before her. Even with her height advantage, she seemed vulnerable in this moment, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing, and everything to do with allowing herself to be seen as worthy. Like exactly who you are, he said. Someone who matters. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. She'd probably learned long ago that crying changed nothing. That the world didn't care about her pain, but this wasn't pain. This was something else. Something that came from being acknowledged as human after too long being treated as less. Callum did something then that surprised them both. He held out his hand, palm up. An invitation, not a demand. Ayanna stared at it for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, she placed her much larger hand in his thank you. She whispered, "You don't need to thank me for basic decency. In my experience, basic decency is the rarest thing in the world." They stood there in the quiet workshop. Two people from completely different worlds, connected by a simple white dress, and the radical act of seeing each other clearly. Outside, the settlement was beginning to wake. Roosters called. Doors opened. Life continued with no idea that everything was about to change. Then Ayanna's head snapped up. Her whole body went rigid. She pulled her hand from his and moved to the window in 3 long strides. When Callum joined her, she was staring out at the eastern horizon. "They're coming," she said. He saw nothing at first, just the pale morning light spreading across the scrubland. Then he noticed it, a dark line in the distance, moving, growing. The sound reached them a moment later. Distant at first, then building. The thunder of hundreds of hooves hitting packed earth. How many? Callum asked, though he already knew. All of them. Ayanna's voice was steady, but her hands gripped the windowsill hard enough that her knuckles went white. "My father sent every warrior, every able-bodied man. They're coming to see what happens when someone treats the chief's daughter like she has value." The dark line resolved into individual shapes. Riders, dozens, becoming hundreds. They moved with military precision, spreading out as they approached the settlement. Not charging, not attacking, but surrounding, creating a circle that would encompass the entire area. Callum's workshop sat on the edge of town, which meant they'd be among the first buildings enclosed. He could see faces now. War paint, feathered headdresses, weapons, carried not in threat, but in ceremony. This wasn't a raid. It was something else entirely. What do they want? He asked. Ayanna turned to face him, the white dress catching the morning light. She looked like something from a story, a legend, a woman who'd walked out of one world and into another, bringing both with her. "They want to witness a binding," she said. "You clothed me in white. You declared my worth in my people's tradition. That makes you responsible for me and me bound to you." The warriors were close enough now that Callum could hear individual voices calling out, not in anger, in something that sounded almost like celebration, like this was what they'd been waiting for. Like 5, 100 men had ridden through the night to witness something that happened so rarely it demanded the entire trib's presence. Ayana's father would be among them, the chief who'd cast her out, coming to see the man who'd done what he should have done, who'd seen his daughter's worth when he decided she had none. "What happens now?" Callum asked. She looked at him with those dark, penetrating eyes. "Now we find out if you meant what you said, if you really see me as worthy, because they're going to ask you to prove it." The first riders entered the settlement. The sound of 500 horses was like controlled thunder. The settlement woke to thunder that wasn't weather. 500 horses moving as one created a sound that shook window panes and sent people running into the streets. Callum watched from his workshop as warriors took positions in a perfect circle around the town, not threatening, not attacking, simply present, undeniable. Samuel Bridger burst from his office, shotgun in hand, face red with panic. Other men emerged with rifles, forming a defensive cluster in the middle of the main street. The kind of desperate bravery that came from being outnumbered and terrified. "Stand down," Callum called from his doorway. "They're not here for war." Samuel's head whipped toward him. "How the hell would you know what they want?" Before Callum could answer, the circle of warriors parted. A single rider came forward, older than the others, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind. He wore a ceremonial headdress that marked him as someone of importance, someone who commanded respect through presence alone. Ayana's entire body went rigid beside Callum. "My father," the chief dismounted with practiced grace despite his age. He walked forward slowly, every movement deliberate. When he was 20 paces away, he stopped and raised his hand, the universal gesture for peace. The other warriors remained motionless on their horses, watching. "I am Chief Tahatan," he called out in clear English, his accent thick, but his words precise. "I come with no weapon in hand. I come to speak with the man who clothed my daughter in white." The settlement held its collective breath. Callum felt every eye turned toward him, felt the weight of a moment that would define everything that came after. He stepped forward, leaving the safety of his doorway. "I'm Callum Ashford." Tahatan studied him with eyes that missed nothing, taking in his weathered hands, his simple clothing, his average height. Seeing a man who posed no physical threat, a craftsman, not a warrior, the silence stretched out until it became almost unbearable. "You know what you have done?" the chief finally asked. "I made her a dress because she needed one. You gave her white fabric. You measured her with your own hands. You spent the night creating something that honored her body as it is, not as others wished it to be." Tahatan's voice carried across the entire settlement. "Do you know what this means in my people's tradition?" Callum felt Ayana tense beside him, but he kept his eyes on her father. "She told me that by clothing her in white, I declared her worthy of respect, of honor. More than that, you declared yourself willing to accept responsibility for her well-being, to see her as valuable when her own people cast her aside." The chief's expression was unreadable. "When I banished my daughter 2 years ago, I told myself it was necessity, that a woman who refused 3 honorable matches brought shame that endangered alliances, that her size and strength made her unmarriageable, that she was a burden to our people." The words landed like physical blows. Ayana stood perfectly still, but Callum could see her hands shaking. "I was wrong," Tahatan said, and his voice cracked slightly. "A father should never convince himself his child has no worth. But I did. I let politics and pride blind me to what should have been clear, that she was exactly as she should be." He took 3 steps closer, close enough that Callum could see the grief written in every line of his face. "You saw in one night what I failed to see in 20 years. You Emoshingi to gave her protieti digpeti when I g self ve, her hims exizes elf. You treated her as precious when I treated her as disposable." The chief's jaw tightened. According to our oldest traditions, when someone outside the tribe honors one of our own in this way, they demonstrate wisdom our own people lacked. They show us our blindness. The 500 warriors remained silent, witnesses to a father's public confession, to a chief admitting failure. The tradition also says this. Tahatan continued that if the man who honored her still stands by his declaration in the light of day in front of her people and his own, then he has proven himself worthy of her and she of him. Callum understood then this wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about accountability, about forcing everyone, including Ayana's father, to witness the moment when someone chose to see her value publicly and without shame. "So I ask you now, Callum Ashford, in front of 500 warriors and your entire settlement," the chief's voice rang out clear and strong. "Do you stand by what the white dress declares? Do you still see my daughter as worthy of honor, respect, and protection? Even knowing that accepting this will bind you to her in our tradition, that you will be choosing her in front of everyone who ever told her she was too much." The settlement had gone utterly silent, every person watching, waiting. Samuel's shotgun hung loose in his hands, forgotten. The warriors sat motionless on their horses, and Ayana stood beside Callum in her white dress, barely breathing. This was the proof they'd come to witness. Not combat, not violence, simply a public choice. Would he honor her in daylight the same way he had in darkness? Would he stand by his declaration when it carried real consequences? Callum looked at Ayana, at the woman who'd eaten scraps in an alley, who'd worn rags because nothing fit, who'd been told repeatedly that her body, her strength, her very existence was wrong, who'd been banished by her own father for refusing to make herself smaller. Then he looked back at Chief Tahatan and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Callum's voice carried across the silent settlement. "I stand by every stitch I made, every measurement I took, every moment I spent creating something worthy of her. Yes, she has value, she has honor, and anyone who can't see that is choosing blindness." The words hung in the morning air, final and irrevocable. Chief Tahatan's expression shifted. Something that might have been relief or pride, or the complicated emotion of a father realizing his daughter had found what he'd failed to give her. He raised his hand, and immediately the 500 warriors dismounted as one. The sound of boots hitting earth was like distant thunder. Then, according to the oldest law of our people, Tahatan declared, "I recognize this binding. Callum Ashford has honored my daughter when her own tribe could not. He has proven himself worthy, through action, not words, through sacrifice of time and skill given freely." He paused, letting the weight of this settle. "In 3 days we will hold the ceremony, here in this place, witnessed by both peoples. Until then, my daughter remains under his protection." Ayana made a sound, small and choked. Callum glanced at her and saw tears streaming down her face. Not sad tears, something else. Release of 2 years of carrying weight alone, of believing she'd never be chosen, never be seen as anything but a problem to solve or a threat to contain. The warriors began setting up camp in open ground surrounding the settlement. No aggression, no demands, simply establishing presence, making it clear they would remain until the ceremony was complete. Until the binding was witnessed properly. Samuel approached cautiously, his shotgun now slung over his shoulder. He looked at Callum with an expression somewhere between shock and grudging respect. "You know what you just did?" "I know exactly what I did. In 3 days, you're going to marry that woman in front of the whole territory." Callum looked at Ayana standing tall in her white dress, no longer trying to make herself smaller. "Yes, why?" Samuel asked, genuinely bewildered. "Why would you tie yourself to her? Why would you risk the tribe's wrath if things went wrong? Why would you choose this? It was the same question everyone had been asking since the moment he'd offered her food in the alley. Why show kindness to someone the world had decided wasn't worth it? The answer had seemed complicated before. Now it felt simple. Because she deserved someone to see her, Callum said, and I had the ability to do something about it. Samuel shook his head, unable to comprehend this logic. He walked away muttering about fools and savages and the end of civilized behavior, but his opinion didn't matter anymore. None of their opinions mattered. Chief Tahatan approached, stopping a respectful distance away. Up close, Callum could see the resemblance, the same strong bone structure, the same penetrating dark eyes, the same presence that commanded space without demanding it. "My daughter," Tahatan said quietly, addressing Ayana directly for the first time, "I wronged you. I let fear guide me instead of love. I told myself I was protecting the tribe, but I was only protecting my own pride." His voice roughened. "You were always exactly as you should be, strong, unbending, worthy. I should have told the men who wanted you to change that they were the ones who needed changing, not you." Ayana's jaw worked. Years of hurt couldn't be erased by one apology, but it was a start. A crack in the wall of anger and abandonment she'd built. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come now when you cast me out 2 years ago?" "Because our scout brought word 3 days ago. They told me a strange thing. That my daughter, who I'd forced to live like an animal, had found someone who saw her as human, as worthy, as deserving of beautiful things made with care." Tahatan's hands clenched and unclenched, and I realized I'd spent 2 years lying to myself, telling myself you were better off gone, that the tribe was stronger without you. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I was afraid that admitting I was wrong would make me look weak. So I let you suffer to protect my image as chief. The confession cost him. Callum could see it in the way the older man's shoulders bowed slightly, in the way his voice dropped. "When I heard someone had honored you with white fabric, with time and skill freely given, I knew I had come to witness what real strength looks like, to see a man who wasn't afraid to declare your value publicly." He met Callum's eyes. "You shamed me without meaning to. You showed me what I should have been doing all along." Ayana stood silent, processing this. The father who'd cast her out was now praising the stranger who'd shown her basic dignity. The complexity of it showed on her face. Gratitude mixed with grief. Hope mixed with old hurt that wouldn't heal quickly. "In 3 days," Tahatan said, addressing both of them now, "we will perform the binding ceremony. According to our tradition, you will stand before both peoples and confirm your choice. Ayana will confirm her acceptance, and you will become family, not just to each other, but to our entire tribe." He turned to leave, then paused. "My daughter, you were always my greatest pride. I'm sorry it took a stranger to remind me of that truth." As the chief walked back toward his warriors, Ayana finally broke. She turned into Callum's shoulder, her powerful frame shaking with sobs she'd held back for too long. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling how small she tried to make herself, even now, how deeply rejection had cut. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You're seen, you're valued. And in 3 days, 500 people are going to witness that truth." She pulled back, wiping her eyes roughly. "I never thought I'd wear white. Never thought anyone would choose me. Then it's time you learned you were wrong about what you're worth." 3 days passed in a strange peace. The warriors remained camped around the settlement, their presence transforming from threat to curiosity. Children from town began approaching the edge of the camp, drawn by the horses and the unfamiliar language. The warriors responded with patience, showing them how to braid rope, demonstrating riding techniques. Fear began giving way to understanding, not friendship yet, but the foundation for it. Callum spent those days with Ayana, learning about her world while she learned about his. She told him about her mother's stories, about the high country where her people lived, about traditions passed down through generations. He showed her his craft, teaching her the names of different fabrics, the purpose of various stitches, simple exchanges that built something neither had expected, trust, connection, the beginning of genuine partnership. On the morning of the third day, Chief Tahatan came to the workshop dressed in full ceremonial regalia, feathered headdress, beaded vest, face painted with marks that held meaning Callum couldn't read but understood were significant. Behind him, the 500 warriors had formed a massive circle in the open ground between the settlement and their camp. Both peoples mixed together now. Curiosity had overcome suspicion. History was being made, whether anyone realized it or not. "It's time," Tahatan said simply. Ayana looked at Callum. "Are you sure? Once this is done, there's no undoing it. You'll be bound to me in ways that go beyond what your people understand as marriage. You'll be family to my entire tribe, responsible not just to me, but to them." Callum took her hand. Her fingers dwarfed his, scarred and powerful. "I've never been more sure of anything." They walked together toward the circle of witnesses. 500 warriors stood silent and solemn. The settlement's people gathered behind them, drawn by spectacle and genuine curiosity. Samuel was there, the shopkeeper, the blacksmith, families with children. Everyone who'd looked at Ayana with disgust or fear now forced to witness her being honored. Chief Tahatan stood in the center of the circle waiting. When Callum and Ayana reached him, he raised his hands and the entire gathering fell silent. Not the silence of fear, the silence of reverence, of witnessing something sacred. "My people," Tahatan began, his voice carrying across the entire assembly. "We gather to witness a binding, to see what happens when someone looks past fear and sees worth. When someone chooses dignity over convenience. When someone creates beauty for one who has been told she deserves nothing beautiful." He gestured to Ayana in her white dress. She stood tall now, no longer trying to make herself smaller.